President made it clear that our policies with respect to Gaza will be dependent upon our assessment of how well the Israelis make changes.
We have conditionality on all aid to all countries, that it has to be used for the intended purpose, chain of command, things like that.
We're seeing the effects of climate change all across the country. For those people who are denying it, you see the effect of these billion-dollar losses.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. President Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke today, their first conversation since an Israeli strike killed 7 aid workers in Gaza. During their phone call, the president pushed Netanyahu to take steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. The White House says he made clear that the U.S.'s policy toward the conflict will be determined by how Israel approaches those issues. Israeli officials have called the strike that killed World Central Kitchen workers unintentional and a mistake, but the organization's founder, Chef Jose Andres, has accused Israel of deliberately targeting them. Olivia Gassas and Nancy Cordes join us now. Olivia is CBS News' intelligence and national security reporter. Nancy is CBS News' chief White House correspondent. It's great to have both of you here. Olivia, we'll begin with you. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, spoke out today about the president's response to the Israelis. What did we learn?
Sure. Well, Secretary Blinken made clear today that the U.S. would change its policy towards Israel absent some credible, immediate steps that the Israeli government would need to take in order to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. He said, if we don't see the changes that we need to see, there will be changes in our own policy. I think it's become abundantly clear to this administration that the rhetoric that it's employed over the past weeks and months has begun to ring hollow, that Israel needs to do more, make fewer mistakes, get more aid in. It started to look feckless, and the domestic and the international pressure now appears to be sufficient that the president is reaching beyond words and for actions. There's plenty of unknowns, including how quickly Israel could implement these changes and what the U.S. response would be, but I think that the shift is marked, and it's happening now.
Nancy, inside the White House, what's your assessment of how they came to this decision? And is it an empty threat to Israel, or is this something that has real meat on the bones in terms of how they deal with the U.S.-Israeli relationship? How are Biden's top advisors talking about this behind the scenes?
I don't know that it's an empty threat, Robert, but it certainly is a vague threat, right? And we tried to push White House officials today for more details when you have the Secretary of the State and the President of the United States saying there are going to be policy changes vis-a-vis our relationship with Israel and the situation in Gaza. If Israel doesn't make changes, what kind of changes are we talking about here? Especially if, as White House officials keep insisting, military aid and conditioning it or withdrawing it is not on the table. And so that was my line of questioning, at least, to the president's national security spokesman, John Kirby, today. Take a listen to what he had to say and what he didn't have to say.
I think what the world wants to understand is the White House warning that it may remove military aid? What exactly is the threat here?
I think I've stated it pretty clearly, and I'm not gonna, as I said earlier, I'm not gonna preview steps. I'm not gonna preview decisions that haven't been made yet. But there are things that need to be done. There are too many civilians being killed. The risk to aid workers is unacceptable.
He went on to say, Robert, that decisions are still being made about exactly what the White House would do to change its policy regarding Gaza if Israel doesn't immediately make these changes to better safeguard humanitarian aid workers and Palestinian civilians. And so, without making any details public, I think leaders around the world are left to wonder, what exactly does the U.S. mean when it says these things?
What exactly does the U.S. mean? What exactly did Secretary of State Blinken mean? Let's play a clip from Secretary Blinken talking about, quote, policy today.
With regard to our policy in Gaza, look, I'll just say this. If we don't see the changes that we need to see, there'll be changes in our own policy.
Olivia, can you help us understand what he's saying here? What is the policy now in the biggest possible picture towards Israel and how it's handling this war? And what's potentially on the table in terms of aid or support for Israel that the U.S. could pluck away at some point?
Sure. It's a great question. And the immediate question is, what can Israel do differently, right? Absent a broader ceasefire unilaterally, there are some bureaucratic and political changes that the Israeli government could do on a pretty immediate basis to facilitate the flow of aid into Gaza. They could streamline inspection processes. They could lift certain import restrictions. They could more effectively facilitate the entry of aid into points in Gaza beyond Rafah, so in northern Gaza in particular. Very importantly, they could also improve their deconfliction coordination with aid groups that are operating in the area. As for the president's options, we've learned through public reporting that a lot of these aid transfers, military arms transfers that continue to happen into Israel are the result of agreements and notifications to Congress that took place years ago, and they continue on a rolling basis. But the president has a lot of discretion here. He could suspend some of those. He could put restrictions on the types of things that are going into Israel, including ammunition. There are other things that he could reach for, including UN resolutions, although it's unclear whether that would actually moderate Israeli behavior. The question is also whether arms transfers would moderate the Israeli government's behavior. Logistically, they probably have what they need in order to continue prosecuting this war in Gaza. Politically, it's unclear whether Netanyahu will be affected by this. It could be that it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. Politically for him, the rift is blamed on Netanyahu, and he has to change course in a particular way. And that's the big unknown that's hanging over his leadership right now.
Nancy, Netanyahu, such a big personality, a looming figure on the world stage for decades now. I think back to the Trump administration, there were always fights. National Security Advisor John Bolton fighting with President Trump, Secretary of State Tillerson fighting with President Trump on policy about how to handle NATO, about how to handle China. What about inside the Biden administration? Not maybe fights, but are there any tensions over this hot button issue over how to handle Israel and especially how to handle Netanyahu? What's your sense of what's really going on?
Well, there are a lot of disagreements within the administration, Robert, about exactly how tough to go on Netanyahu. And certainly there has been some frustration that's been made public about the fact that this president, in particular, President Biden, who has been in the public sphere for decades and has long hewed to this traditional belief that Israel is the United States' closest ally in the region and needs to be supported and protected no matter what. And so there were certainly officials here who wanted him to speak out against Netanyahu more forcefully and even sooner than he did. And even going beyond the administration, Robert, there is a growing number of Senate Democrats now who are coming out publicly and saying either that they believe that there should be new conditions or restrictions placed on U.S. military aid, or that aid should be halted altogether. And that's putting new pressure on the president as well.
That pressure from the Democrats, a big issue. We'll get into that in our next discussion on America Decides this evening. But for now, Olivia Gossas and Nancy Cordes, thank you so much for your reporting. A judge has denied former President Donald Trump's attempts to dismiss the classified documents case. Judge Eileen Cannon ruled the Presidential Records Act does not shield Trump from charges that he unlawfully retained national defense information. Special counsel Jack Smith charged Trump in a 40-count indictment last year that includes alleged violations of the Espionage Act. The former president has pleaded not guilty to all charges. No Labels, meanwhile, has announced they will not put up a presidential contender. We'll dig into why that's happening with our panel. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. President Biden and Democrats are facing real political pressure when it comes to Israel's war with Hamas. That includes sharp remarks from some of the president's closest allies. Here's Delaware Senator Chris Coons this morning.
I think we're at the point where President Biden has said, and I have said, and others have said, if Benjamin Netanyahu, prime minister, were to order the IDF into Rafah at scale, they were to drop 1,000-pound bombs and send in a battalion to go after Hamas and make no provision for civilians or for humanitarian aid, that I would vote to condition aid to Israel. I've never said that before.
Let's bring in our panel, Margaret Talev and Molly Ball. Margaret is the director of Syracuse University's Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship, a great group. Molly is a senior political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Great to have both of you here. Let's begin, Margaret, with what we just heard from Senator Coons. Earlier in the show, we heard about the administration's position on the call with Netanyahu, how they're going to move forward on policy. But what about all of this clamor from Democrats on this front?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it certainly sounds that what President Biden has been saying and what the administration has been signaling is a shift. But will it really be, and what will it be? Senator Coons is very often seen as kind of a proxy or a foreshadower of what Biden's stance will be. So from him, did we see him breaking away or trying to pull Biden there, or did we see him foreshadowing what's going to happen? I think both in the prelude to this call and the actual readout of the call itself, it certainly sounds like the administration is suggesting that they might do something, but they have not explicated what or what the conditions are, how many more crossings, how much more aid needs to get through. Are they talking about actually halting anything? What about these arms sales? What about the transfer of bombs? We just don't know yet.
How intense is this debate inside the Democratic Party about how to handle Netanyahu?
I think it's very intense. I think, what we saw from the readout of the call, the fact that the president apparently told Netanyahu there needs to be an immediate ceasefire and didn't mention the hostages, which he usually does. This is a clear shift in tone. I think there's a shift in public opinion as well after the attack on the aid convoy earlier this week. But this has been splitting the Democratic Party for months, really since the outset of the war. We've seen all these protests in the streets. I think Jewish Americans who are predominantly Democrats have been in one place. Arab and Muslim Americans and a lot of voters of color have been in another place. And we've seen a lot of very acrimonious, people yelling at each other in Democratic caucus meetings and so on. So this has been splitting the Democratic Party for a while. But we see that, that view on the left that Israel needed to be reined in is gaining more and more currency as the war goes on and as public opinion shifts in that direction. Another political story today, No Labels is not going to field a ticket. They're not going to pursue a presidential contender in any way. Larry Hogan decided to run for Senate. Joe Manchin said no, the West Virginia senator. So does this have a real impact on the 2024 election?
I think you nailed it to this extent. If you're going to be a third party, campaign effort, you need both to have ballot access and you need to have a candidate. They just didn't have a candidate. And so you could, in a way, see this coming for months. You saw Manchin, you saw Hogan say no. Nikki Haley didn't want to do this. Chris Christie wasn't going to do it. And so how can you do it? Part of the big pressure and concern that No Label has faced, not just from the Democratic side, but kind of from the anti-Trump side of the Republican Party, is like, if you field a candidate, probably all this might do is actually just ensure that Trump gets another term. I'm not sure that this resolves that debate because in the meantime, RFK has been proceeding apace as an independent candidate. So what No Labels could have represented, it's possible he will represent anyway. To me, the question is what happens to the future of an organized effort for third parties?
What's your take on that? I mean, we've talked about No Labels for so long and who would be the candidate if they're going to have a candidate. But is the media almost underplaying the possible political influence of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in this campaign?
Well, when I spoke with the late No Labels chairman, Joe Lieberman, a few months ago, what I was really struck by was how disorganized the effort was. They had a lot of money, but they didn't really have a process. They'd gone from saying they would have a convention to just sort of making calls and reaching out to people. They were in this paradoxical situation, to your question, where there was obviously a huge market for what they were doing. There are obviously a lot of Americans out there who are exhausted by the political process and disenchanted with the two major parties. On the other hand, there aren't enough of them for a third-party ticket to win. And therefore, they would have represented a spoiler. And so that was what had created all this animosity for them. But because there is still that huge tranche of Americans who don't like either of the major party candidates, there's a big opportunity for someone like an RFK. And all that rage that had been directed at No Labels is going to be directed at him and at any other third party candidate who could be that kind of a spoiler.
And so much of the No Labels discussion is about there's a desire among voters we're all encountering on the trail for something different, some kind of person or ticket or populism to go against what's happening in Washington. And I just want to stay with you, Molly, for a second. You've covered the FTC chair, Lina, did a big profile for the Wall Street Journal about conservatives, Republicans who are kind of echoing and supporting what Lina Khan's doing at the FTC. I've spent a lot of time in recent weeks digging into Lina Khan and the politics of populism. Do you believe that this is maybe now on the front burner for both parties, how to address anger towards corporations, anger toward Wall Street and tech?
So I would say two things about that. I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. I think we're in a moment of political realignment when a lot of the policy platforms that the two parties historically represented are coming up for debate. Because of Trump and because of the sort of populist moment that we're in, both Democrats and Republicans are reevaluating where they've stood on particularly economic issues. And so, secondly, Lina Khan, the FTC, Jonathan Cantor at the Department of Justice, these antitrust hawks who are trying to change 40 years of legal precedent for how competition and trust busting have been treated by our government, they see themselves as representing this sort of populist vanguard, attacking big corporations, saying it's not enough to have a government that treats everybody fairly. We've got to have big business that's fair to everybody, too. And that hasn't been enough of a priority. And we've seen the Biden administration take a very aggressive, surprisingly aggressive approach to this and get a lot of Republicans surprisingly on their side.
It's interesting. Whether it's John Podesta talking about climate, Lina Khan at the FTC, there's so many policy issues that are just kind of hovering beneath the surface of this presidential campaign. Molly Ball, Margaret Talev, we really appreciate you both. The White House is touting $20 billion in new clean energy investments. The president's climate advisor joins us to discuss its potential impact. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The EPA today awarded $20 billion in federal green grants for clean energy projects across the country. These green bank funding projects were created under the Inflation Reduction Act. Let's bring in Senior Advisor to the President for International Climate Policy, John Podesta. John, we appreciate your time and for stopping by America Decides. Tell me about the impact you believe this investment is going to make from the EPA and make it real and tangible for Americans.
Well, thanks, Bob, and thanks for having me on. Look, this is a historic program. The Vice President and EPA Administrator Michael Regan were in North Carolina announcing $20 billion going to bring the benefits of clean energy, more efficient appliances, building retrofits to small businesses and individuals all across the country, but particularly to disadvantaged communities. Often bear the brunt of power plant and industrial pollution, but lack access to credit to be able to do something about it in their own homes and in their own businesses. So what this program does is provides financing through community development financial institutions so that they can benefit from these new advances in clean energy as well.
When I'm traveling the country, John, reporting on this campaign, it's evident that working voters in places like North Carolina, Michigan, and elsewhere, their votes are up for grabs in this campaign. Former President Trump and Republicans reaching out to them as well. What makes the Democratic approach, the Biden administration's approach on the climate in particular, different than what they're hearing from Republicans?
Look, we're bringing tangible benefits to communities, as I noted, all across the country, from the investments that are going in that have already created 200,000 jobs, over $350 billion of investments in clean technology, to the kinds of efforts we're doing today to lower people's utility bills, to bring them the benefits of pollution reduction in their own communities. So it's very real, it's very tangible. It's the result of the Biden-Harris's commitment to tackling the climate crisis by investing in a cleaner economy and one that's working for all working Americans. And you know, I think as people feel that, they're going to understand that what the other side is offering is really just to go backwards and to stay in the pocket of fossil fuel industry. And I think that what we need to do is make sure they understand what this is doing for them individually.
Is it a challenge sometimes, John, to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and to remind people about the climate components of that legislation? Because frankly, sometimes when I'm talking to voters, they don't connect climate policy, green policy with what was passed in the IRA.
I think that's always been a challenge, which is to make the connection about investing in the future, investing in clean technology, seeing the kind of economic activity we're seeing around the country, and the direct effect on reducing emissions. Again, by transitioning to these clean technologies, I think it improves communities, it improves air quality, it improves public health, and most importantly, it reduces utility bills and helps people save money.
What's the import of Vice President Harris being out front? Of course, the president is as well, but she's out there on the road talking about this program, touting what the administration's doing on climate policy. What should we make of that? What do you make of it?
Look, the vice president's been a fighter on the climate front since she was Attorney General in California, and she, of course, brings that passion to the White House and to the vice presidency. She's been particularly active on ensuring that low and moderate income people have access to credit, and working with community development financial institutions to make sure that whether that's for housing or for, as I said, buying clean appliances, et cetera, that they have full access to credit. And that's why she's championed this program in particular. It's the first of its kind. It's really bringing down the cost for these clean technologies to people in their homes and in their small businesses. If a pizza parlor in Detroit wants to put solar panels on its roof or retrofit its building, and it really has a hard time getting credit, what this program will do is to make sure that there are nonprofit financial institutions that are providing that kind of credit to help people save money and to build up their businesses and save money in their homes as well.
John, you're obviously a top advisor now to President Biden on the climate, but you've worn many hats in your career: chief of staff at the White House for President Clinton, chair of the Clinton campaign in 2016, think tank work. You've been in so many different areas across the policy and political spectrum. When you step back and look at climate policy and climate politics, how do you really believe it's going to impact and influence this election? We hear it's a galvanizing issue for young voters. We see that in some polling. But how do you assess it as a veteran strategist and advisor?
Look, I think, the president likes to say, when I hear climate, I hear jobs. I think he's made it central to the economic future of the country by making sure that the United States is leading the world in investment in clean energy technologies. We're seeing the effects of climate change all across the country. For those people who are denying it, you see the effect of these billion-dollar losses from forest fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts Southwest. But the question is, what are we going to do about it? And I think the president's provided the strongest answer of any political leader in the world, which is we're going to invest our way into a better future for the public. And I think that's a winning message across this political spectrum. You see voters of every party and independents in the middle being strongly supportive of this investment-led strategy. So, I think the president will be out there not only just talking about what he's already accomplished, but what he's going to do to move the country forward, reduce our emissions, and build up an economy that's going to work for everyone.
John Podesta at the White House, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob.
That does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides on Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.